good day to you and welcome back. Well, in the course of being a typewriter collector, you may have begun to learn the skills of cleaning and degreasing your machines so you can do the upkeep yourself rather than paying a professional to do it for you. This video today is not going to be about the whole process of cleaning and degreasing typewriters, but it's about a specific technique that I found that helps me to discover which individual type bars are actually sticky. Because in the course of typing, you might notice that just once in a while, a type bar or two might hang up or stick and not release back to the home position. And those can be very devilish and very frustrating kinds of problems. But I want to walk you through this simple technique to test out your typewriter to see if you have any sticky type bars. And if you do, then you can target specific cleaning and degreasing of those linkages to get that particular key working properly. So the first thing you want to do is you want to take your typewriter, and if the bottom panel is in place, you want to remove the bottom panel. This is a 5 Series Smith Corona, so it doesn't have a bottom panel. So what you want to do after the bottom panel is accessible is you want to set the typewriter back on its rear panel vertically like this. Okay, the second step is you want to locate the universal bar on the typewriter. And the best way to do that is to press one of the character keys. And you'll see a linkage that goes across all of the type bar linkages, and it'll be moving when you press a key. That is your universal bar. What the universal bar does is it activates the ribbon lift and moves the ribbon spools or turns them. So what we want to do here is we want to activate the universal bar manually by hand now that we know where it's at. And you can push up this bar on the 5 Series on either end however you wish. Next, we're going to turn the typewriter over so we can see the front of it or the top of it and see the keys. So when you activate the universal bar by hand, you will notice the ribbon will lift. That's how you know you have it activated. And now with it activated, what you want to do is start with each key, press the key lever down fully, and then slowly release it. So you want to release it slowly. And this is how you can test for any type bars that are sticking or hanging up. Here we'll try the number 1 key. And you can see here that the type bar won't release all the way back. And this is a good example of why this technique works. And now let me explain it to you why it works. So every key lever linkage has its own spring. And you can see there's a whole row of them here on this typewriter. So each one has a spring which helps to pull the type bar back to the home position. However, the universal bar is also spring-loaded. Here you might be able to see one of the 2 springs that actually helps pull the universal bar back, and also attached to the universal bar is the touch control system. So the touch control adds some additional spring tension to the universal bar. And what this means is that the universal bar itself helps to pull the type bar linkages back to their home position. So the type bar linkages are being pulled back by a combination of their own springs plus the springiness of the universal bar. So then when we do this little test, we're moving the universal bar out of the way so it will not assist the type bar linkages to be pulled back to their rest position. Instead, the type bar is forced to pull its own weight back uphill against gravity to the rest position using the power of only its individual spring. So you can think of this as the worst case condition. If there's any additional forces keeping the type bar linkages from moving freely, you will find it right here in this test because it has to struggle to raise its own type bar back up to the rest position. If you have a little bit of stickiness, you're going to see it. The type bar will stick. It won't raise all the way back up. So now that you've discovered which individual characters have sticky linkages, now we have to come to the question of, well, which individual linkage is it? Well, the most obvious one to check first is the segment right here where the curved fulcrum rod connects all of the type bars individually to their drive linkages. And a good way to see which individual actual joint is causing the stiffness is I use a squeeze bottle of alcohol. When the type bar is hung up and sticky, you can squirt some alcohol right on the joint, and if that's the culprit, it'll usually free itself up right away. But if it's not, then you have to go and look at some of the other linkages for that same character. So to investigate further which individual joint is causing the stiffness, you can hit these joints here, and you can also hit these joints here in this secondary segment, and even down here where the clevis pins connect to the type bars themselves. You can try all those one at a time and see which one, when you wet it with alcohol, will free up the joint. Now, machines other than Smith Corona 5 series are going to have their own versions of all of these secondary connections. But you need to go ahead and check all of them individually to see which one is actually gummed up. And also don't forget the little slots in the comb where the key lever bars slide up and down in. You want to also check those. Those can get gummy, full of dust and eraser crumbs, and cause it to stick as well. So once you've isolated the individual sticky joints that are causing those particular characters to hang up, I would advise switching from alcohol to lacquer thinner. I use them in a squeeze bottle, and I should caution you, if you're going to use lacquer thinner, please do it something like outdoors. And I will squirt the lacquer thinner into the joint. I'll exercise that key, and then before it dries up, I will take a compressed air gun from an air compressor and blow that gunk, that lacquer thinner that has the gunk suspended in it, blow it out of the machine, and that'll take some of the gunk with it. And then you repeat the process. Squirt more lacquer thinner, work the joint, exercise it, and then blow the lacquer thinner out. I typically set the typewriter on a heavy, thick towel to absorb all the stuff that comes out. When you're using lacquer thinner, and even alcohol, make sure you don't get it on any painted surfaces or any plastics. So if your machine is never been serviced, as far as you know, it's just totally gunky, then don't bother with the individual type bar test until you thoroughly degrease the entire machine. So to thoroughly degrease your machine, I recommend doing so outdoors, at least if the weather is warmer. I like to set it out on a little work table within easy access of my air compressor hose. I'll start by a combination of paintbrush and compressed air, and I'm trying to dislodge as much as the loose particles of dust, grit, eraser shavings, eraser crumbs, correction tape crumbs, or whatever. And I'll start with the segment. I'll try to get the slots of the segment. I'll try to get underneath the ribbon spools and underneath the machine also, to try to remove as much of the loose stuff as possible. But also be very careful around the springs and other tiny little parts. Don't blow them too violently with your air compressor because you might dislodge them. Also, don't forget about the carriage area itself. Move both margins to the outermost extreme so you can move the carriage back and forth to its farthest extremes, and try to remove as much of the eraser crumbs, whiteout, and all kinds of grit and dirt with a combination of your brush and compressed air. And then before you use any solvents, remember to remove the ribbon, of course. So the ideal situation for using solvents, especially lacquer thinner, is to remove the chassis from the body panels. But here, I've gone ahead and just covered the keyboard, and I'll cover the carriage area with cloths to keep the alcohol and or lacquer thinner away from the painted surfaces and plastic surfaces. And I'm going to spray the solvent into the segment, and then I'm going to work the keys rapidly to get the solvent worked into the gaps in there and to dissolve as much of the grit as possible. And then I'll take an air compressor, and while I'm working the keys, I will try to blow as much of that grit that's now suspended in the solvent, blow it through the machine to the bottom where I have a towel that the machine is sitting on that can absorb the grunge that's in there. So keep in mind that the purpose for doing the degreasing is the lubricants that were once in the machine that were helping the metal parts to stay smooth and not sticky, they have dried up and turned into glue or something resembling glue. And you have to use solvents in order to dissolve those hardened lubricants. And that's why we degrease the typewriters. You might have degreased your typewriter and the type bars are no longer sticking, and now you can type on it freely. But you might have noticed that it kind of feels like the machine, the feel of it is a little heavier than it should be. Like you were hoping the keys would feel a little lighter than they do. And part of that could be simply the design of the machine. It could simply be that it has a heavy touch, but there's a few things you can do to troubleshoot that. So what I recommend doing for this test is to set your typewriter up on a couple wooden blocks so that it's elevated enough that you can get your hand underneath it and feel the universal bar. And here you can see that I'm actually moving the universal bar because my vibrator is moving up and down. So in this test, we're going to move the universal bar into its fully activated position so the ribbon vibrator is up. And so when you type on the keys, you're not going to be feeling the force of the universal bar itself. So now the universal bar is active, and now you can type on the keys with your normal force, and you can see if it feels considerably or significantly lighter in touch. If you notice a significant difference in typing touch with the universal bar activated all the time, then that means that the problem with the touch on your machine is associated with the linkages in parts that do the ribbon lift and or the rotation of the ribbon spools. So one of the places you might want to look at is the universal bar itself has a pivot point on both sides. And the 5 Series Smith Corona, it rotates in the little slot right there. Any of those could be gummed up with old oils, causing it to be harder to push. But also, there's a linkage here that has a pivot, which could be gummed up, and that rotates another part on the inside, which could be gummed up. And that, in turn, operates the ribbon lift mechanism, which has some parts that slide, and those could be gummed up and need to be degreased. And then in this machine, there is a rod right here that rotates as you do the ribbon lift. It has a pivot point back here toward the right. There's a pivot point which could be tight, gummed up, maybe needs adjusting and cleaning and lubing, and then the other end of that shaft does the actual lifting of the vibrator, and that vibrator, as it moves on its track, could also be gummed up and needs to be degreased and cleaned. So any of these parts associated with the ribbon lift could be giving you extra tension on the universal bar, making the keys feel heavier. And you should also be looking at the ribbon drive system. This cross shaft, it has a couple bushings that need to be lubricated, and then each individual spool that goes up, the spindle that goes up to the ribbon spool, you need to clean and lubricate those bushings so they'll turn freely. This reversing system, how it flips back and forth, all of this needs to be cleaned, degreased, and put a little bit of lube on it where this rod runs through a hole in the bracket, could be rubbing. Any of these parts can give you a tightness in the machine that contributes to the keys feeling heavy. So besides the parts underneath the machine for the ribbon drive system, you also want to clean, degrease, and lightly lubricate this shaft here that actually turns the ribbon spools. There's a bushing that the shaft penetrates through the bottom plate there that needs to be cleaned and degreased, and also where it penetrates up into this cup should also be cleaned, degreased, and lubricated lightly. So anything that will affect the smooth operation of the ribbon lift of the vibrator and or the ribbon spools turning will put extra tension on the universal bar, and that in turn will cause the keys to feel heavier. Of course, as typewriter hobbyists, we often will find typewriters out in the world that have never been serviced for a long time, but it costs money to bring those to a professional repair shop and have them professionally serviced. So this is why a lot of us try to learn to do our own, at least cleaning and degreasing. In order that you can then have a reliable machine that won't bug you when you're using it, it'll give you great joy and you can be creative with it. And so I wish you the very best in your creative pursuits. And as always, have yourselves a great day and bye-bye for now.